Well, good afternoon, everybody. I am Nina Woodward, Director of Chase Emerson Memorial Library located in Deer Isle, and I'm so pleased you are all able to join us today to learn about climate change in the Gulf of Maine, presented by Dr. Carla Guenther. Dr. Guenther earned her undergraduate degree at Worcester Polytechnic Institute. After studying lobster behavior at Woods Hole, Massachusetts, she spent time in Baja California, Mexico, where she learned about a special form of community-based co-management. Inspired by fishermen's level of organization and management structure, Carla gained her PhD in marine science at the University of California, Santa Barbara. She engaged Santa Barbara's commercial lobster fleet while conducting interviews for her doctoral research on marine protected area impacts on socioeconomics, reef ecology, and fishing behavior. These interviews became the basis of her communication with the rest of California's commercial lobster fleet and fostered the fisheries application for Marine Stewardship Council certification, proposed legislation for self-funding lobster management science, and voluntary fishery collection of biological data for use in the first stock assessment of California's spiny lobster populations. Educated in oceanography, ecology, and anthropology, Carla approaches fisheries management with a focus on fishing communities. She moved to Deer Isle in 2010 to work with the Maine Center for Coastal Fisheries. Since arriving, her life has become more full, and she is now married to Dominic Zanke, and they have a daughter named Cameron. Carla oversees MCCF's scientific research collaborations, fishermen engagement efforts around science and policy, and translates scientific observations for fishermen and fishermen's observations for scientists and managers. She is an invaluable resource for our community. Her education, background, and professional development contribute so much to the continued dialogue around the preservation of commercial fishing and the far-reaching ramifications of its well-being. Carla will be taking questions at the end of the presentation through the Q&A function. So if questions come up while she's speaking, please feel free to go ahead and type them in. It will help us to get to as many questions as possible if you do. And now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Carla Guenther as she presents climate change in the Gulf of Maine.
Hi, thank you, Nina, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you all for joining us this afternoon. I see there's a few folks from DMR who should know some of this material intimately. So good to see you and thank you for joining us. And I will move right into sharing my screen with my talk. And let's make sure that we go into presentation mode. And then there's one more tool I want to turn on, and that would be the laser pointer. Okay. So again, thank you all. And thank you, Nina, for the invitation to address your community here associated with the Chase Emerson Library here in Deer Isle. This is a photo for those of you who are attending not from the island or not familiar with the island. This is the view of Stonington Harbor, at least only about half of Stonington Harbor. And for those of you who imagine the center of Maine's lobster fishing fleet being dominated by large boats, this is actually it. It's about an average of about a 38 to 40 foot vessel, and they're all owner operated. A bit about me. So there I am performing my research in California, and I earned my PhD there, as Nina had said, and I've been the chief scientist at MCCF since 2010. Nina had also mentioned that I married a local fisherman, Dominic Zanke, who has been fishing since 1990. Here he is with a bounty of shrimp that he landed about 6 years before the closure of the fishery. And this is my daughter, Cameron, or our daughter, Cameron, and she has been independent since 2016. So on to our topic of discussion this evening or this afternoon, climate change. It's something we see and hear a lot about in the newspapers, in televised news, and all over the place. And we can just see recap a few of the headlines from various places about Maine fisheries about lobster moving north, cod going down. Here's the one about the shrimp closure. We've got the future of Maine's lobster fishery. Climate change brought a boom, but now it can cause a bust. What does all of this really mean for our fisheries and our coastal communities who are so dependent upon them here in Maine? So I choose today to sort of discuss a little bit about how has climate changed in the Gulf of Maine, and to give each of us as savvy readers of news and science a couple tricks in order to be able to help interpret what it is that we're reading when we read about climate change. So climate, again, is a long-term pattern of what controls the shorter-term pattern of weather. And this is something that we all need to keep in mind. It's something we like to say, oh, it's a really hot year, climate change, or oh, it's a really cold winter, haha, climate change isn't happening. We need to be looking at long-term sorts of trends that we're seeing in changing temperatures, changing circulation patterns, changing ecologies of the areas that we're talking about. So here is my laser pointer. Hopefully everyone can see this. This is sea surface temperature off of the Booth Bay Harbor. And you can see here, this is the data set used in the oft-cited statement that the Gulf of Maine is warming faster than 98% of the world's oceans. They use this 10-year time series that includes the 2012 warming event. And that 2012 warming event moved our sea surface temperatures by 8 degrees centigrade. And of course, that is a driving trend and creating a slope of a line that is much more intense than the long-term slope of the line. So that's something to be, that's one of those kind of things to keep in the back of your mind when you're reading about climate change, is we want to think about temporal scale, time scales. We also want to be thinking about geographic scales. So here's a picture of the world's oceans, where red means it's warming quickly or warming a lot, and blue means that it's actually cooling over time. And we again see here in Pershing's paper that the Gulf of Maine is intensely red, and that is largely driven by this shorter time series right here. This is another piece of information showing us how the water temperature at 1 meter depth, so basically sea surface temperature at the eastern Maine shelf, which is just due south of about Mount Desert Island. And the yellow bar, this is from 2001 to 2018, and the yellow indicates the highs and the lows over that time series. The blue line is the average over the time series, and the orange dots are the monthly, actually the daily means for the day in 2016. So in 2016, it's just kind of a random selection I had. You can see how in 2016 it was warmer than the average kind of throughout the cycle of the year. And one thing that we'll be seeing, so this is another tool we have by our oceanographic buoys to monitor change in temperature over time. And then again, this is Booth Bay Harbor warming that we see. So we have lots of data sets that we can be looking at to monitor how weather, temperature, and climate is changing in Maine. So what effect are these observations already having on Maine's fisheries? For this story, I take two of Maine's iconic fisheries, the lobster and the pink shrimp, which have had, as you can see, very different trajectories as a result of the warming that we've observed in the Gulf of Maine. Lobster has enjoyed this warming over time with a five-fold increase in landings. And then shrimp has been shut down, has essentially collapsed with warming events and warming waters, and has been closed for about 7 years and hasn't opened back up. So why has the story been so different for these two critters? First, let's talk about the American lobster. The American lobster ranges in the United States from mid-coast Virginia all the way up to the US-Canadian border. And we are here in Maine at its northernmost region in the US, but we all know that lobster exists healthily in abundance all up around the Atlantic Maritimes. And we can see in 2000 these darker patches where the intensity of lobster landings occurred again in the year 2000. Here in Maine, we use these 7 lobster zones to manage our state lobster catch. And we're located here in Stonington, basically in the heart of Zone C. And Zone C has been the largest lobster zone or lobster landing zone for the past decade at least. It used to be, this is another off-cited statistic, here was kind of the golden triangle of lobster landings in the 70s. And so we have seen a shift in where lobsters are predominantly landed along the coast of Maine. And this here is basically a pretty picture of lobster larvae developing to the point where lobsters are floating in the water column among the water surface and exposed to surface water temperatures and eating zooplankton and phytoplankton until the point they reach this stage and they're seeking to settle on the bottom and begin their lives as benthivores. Okay, so what have we seen with lobster? So again, here's an important point to that trick I was saying. Always use a spatial or a geographic lens when you're looking at discussions of climate change. Here on the top left, we have the lobster abundance stock assessment for the Gulf of Maine and Georges Bank, and we can see an increase over time. But we often hear of reports of a collapse of lobster related to climate change. And that is the story of the southern abundance, the southern New England stock unit. And we hear that this is coming to us here in the Gulf of Maine, but we don't know when, and we don't know how, and we don't know, well, we might know how, but we don't know when, and we don't know how long it would take to look like this if it were to ever look like this. So we have to keep in mind again that the patterns and the oceanography and the drivers of the southern stock unit are very different from the drivers that affect the northern stock unit, even though it's the same animal. So the Gulf of Maine lobsters grew 3 times in 20 years, while landings grew 5 times. And you can see again here how Georges Bank has pretty much stayed the same over time, even though they're lumped together in the top left graph. Southern New England has declined, while the Gulf of Maine has greatly increased. And so this increase that we're seeing in the top left graph is mostly driven by the increase in lobsters in the Gulf of Maine. Why would this be? Why have lobsters done so well with warming temperatures where in the southern abundance, the southern stock abundance did not fare so well? Well, one of the things contributing to this is that we have fewer predators. The green line is cod abundance over time, and the red line is lobster and cod landings, not abundance. Cod landings have declined and lobster landings have increased. And you can see them overlapping here around 1995. And that's just about the same time that the last groundfish boat ever left out of Stonington Harbor. So we stopped participating here in Eastern Maine. We essentially stopped participating in the groundfish fishery because the stocks had declined right off of our shores in the early to mid 90s. So with fewer predators, that meant that lobsters were able to thrive, or they were released from predatory pressure. At the same time, there's this phenomenon of warming water. And so remember that image of the lobster larvae. When they're looking to settle down to the bottom, they've now developed, they've eaten everything they're going to eat at the surface of the water. They've traveled, and now they're looking for ideal temperatures. And they're looking for ideal temperatures to settle to the bottom. They have a 12 to 16 degrees centigrade thermal threshold. So that's their ideal temp they're looking for. When they're scooting along the water surface, bouncing to the bottom to look for ideal habitat, here it's too cold, here it's been too warm, but here ended up right here in zone C, ended up being kind of a sweet spot for the past decade or 20 years. It's been a sweet spot for lobsters to settle. Additionally, so not just this sort of zone, this area laterally along the coast, but also in depth, we see this, this area here that there's this expansion along the coast out to deeper waters that have become, with warming bottom temperatures, that have become more ideal for lobsters to settle. And then then we have this additional phenomenon where habitat and location has changed, where we're seeing lobsters. So they now have fewer predators. They have more expanded area where they can settle to the bottom and survive as juveniles. And then we have sea sampling data here from 2003 to 2013, where you can see this increase of lobsters that are trapped on the mud bottom versus a decrease in lobsters that are trapped on rocky bottom. And what this is showing is that there are more lobsters available on the muddy bottom than potentially those available on the rocky bottom. And that shows us that with this release from predators, lobsters no longer need to hide in rocky bottom, and that the advantage of fighting over ideal habitat between individual lobsters is kind of no more, where they're able to survive well on the mud and expand and occupy new habitats and new locations. We're also seeing the expansion into deeper water with, again, the seasonality and location of lobster landings, the blue bars being the fall and winter, and the green being the summer landings, where we used to see in the early 2000s a domination of fishing activity and lobster landings from the summer. In 2009, we really see the shift to fall and winter landings being the dominant portion of the fishing activity and landings. This is showing deep water. This is typically a deeper water. The lobsters have moved offshore, and this is a deeper water fishery and landings trajectory. We see some catch up here, and I think that's not exactly sure how to explain how this becomes 50-50, but I'll say that in 2019, we definitely saw a domination of the fall and winter landings again. So here's our story about northern pink shrimp. They were largely a part of kind of a secondary fishery for our fleet here in Maine. Guys would convert their lobster boats to a trawler. They would put on this A-frame, and they would put on 30, 40, 50 foot nets on the back, and it was a lucrative or supplemental winter fishery. And here's the northern pink shrimp here. They are a sex-changing marine crustacean where they start their lives out as males, and then at 3 years of age, roughly, they become females. And you can see them bearing eggs here and here. But one of the things that was very different about pink shrimp as opposed to lobster is that they are at their southern extent. Here in the Gulf of Maine, this is about as far south as they exist. They actually exist far up towards Iceland. And so being at their southern extent, they've always been much more of an ephemeral species here, which is one of the reasons why it was more of a supplemental fishery. When they were here, guys were able to take advantage of being able to harvest them. When they weren't here, they could lay off of them and maybe scallop for the winter or do something else. So pink shrimp come ashore in Maine's winter. They like to kind of over summer in the deep water basins here because, again, they're a cold water species. So they would summer in the deep basins and then come ashore in Maine's winter. And that's when they would be captured by the fishery. There's a summer shrimp survey, or there was, for this species. And here is the southern kind of extent of the Gulf of Maine. In 2009, the larger the pink and the larger dots correspond to the density of catch. So more shrimp were caught in the bigger dots. And then shifting to 2017, you can see how shrimp were not broadly dispersed through the survey area. They had a few little aggregations in these spaces here, but by and large, we had much less distribution of shrimp in 2017. And this is about 4 years after the fishery had been closed. So we're still seeing a pretty low abundance. This is 2009. This is about 4 years before the fishery closed. So what's going on with shrimp? This is something here that the shrimp survey provides. It's basically a shrimp demographics. And again, they start out as males, which is yellow here. And then first year females are purple and second year females are orange. And each one of these humps is essentially a year class coming through. And what you want to see in a healthy population is you want to see these sort of multiple humps being measured across the size classes, because that tells you that we're, you know, here it's one thing because they're being harvested at ideally this size range right here. So you'd expect to see some reduction in the hump at this point. But this is 2009. You see some added pressure on this same year class, and then you see that this year class is gone. And then you see that the shrimp population doesn't even get measured on this scale. We have to expand the scale so we can start to see some resolution and some humps in the year classes. And here's the warming event of 2012 we hear a lot about. And we see basically no shrimp surviving or showing up in the 2013 survey. We see the shrimp are trying pretty hard with another next year class in 2014. This is when the fishery closed. And then we can see this year class moving through to 2015 without a successive year class coming in. Then we see a successful year class, and then we see nothing. And this is without shrimp, this is without fishing activity. So this is very concerning, telling us that there's something happening to the population of shrimp outside of the fishing pressure. So shrimp biomass has declined, but why? And it has a little something to do with water temperatures at relevant locations in the life history of the animal. The shrimp aggregate in the fall, and then they bear their eggs in the early part of the winter. And when they come ashore, they're egg bearing, and then they release their eggs throughout, you know, up until about March, April. And in that timing of the eggs being hatched and the larvae being released into the water, they need to have phytoplankton available to them to eat so they survive. And this warming water on these latter trends in the spring have been consistent with spring blooms being below average since 2013. So the availability of nutritious food for the larvae when they hatch has really put a hurting on the shrimp. So temperature affects critical processes. Not only is larval survival lower, we also see that the egg production index is lower. So we're seeing warmer temperatures when the shrimp are aggregating to mate. And then we're also seeing that egg survival, there is the adhesive that holds these eggs to the shrimp underbellies is temperature sensitive. And in warmer water, it's less adhesive. And so maybe the shrimp aren't necessarily holding on to their eggs as long as they need to ensure their survival. So not only are we making fewer eggs, their survival is lower, and then the next stage is also lower because it isn't timed well with food availability. So there it is. We have a closed shrimp fishery. It doesn't look like it's going to be coming back anytime soon. So two very different stories of climate change in Maine's fisheries. So what can we continue to expect from climate change? We can expect that it will be dynamic, but why? What's going on here in the Gulf of Maine? And just this image of all these arrows going everywhere can kind of tell the story that it's pretty dynamic. And I'll try to simplify the story for you a bit, where the surface, so in this image, surface flow is the blue, and bottom water flow is the pink arrows. And the Gulf of Maine is characterized by these two entry points. You have the Northeast Channel and you have the Southern Channel here off of Georges Bank. And this is how water enters the Gulf of Maine sometimes, and then it also enters through here sometimes. So then we have this flow. This is called the Eastern Maine Coastal Current, and this is Penobscot Bay. And the Eastern Maine Coastal Current will branch off here and cycle around this basin. And then we also see flow coming in here, and then also somewhat branches off of at Penobscot Bay. So we want to see where the water is coming from in the Gulf of Maine, and that the source of our water is largely what drives what temperature the Gulf of Maine will be. So if anybody here saw the Day After Tomorrow, it was a very dramatic kind of sci-fi reality-based movie about climate change about 2008, I think, and it starred Jake Gyllenhaal, and it was about this Atlantic meridional oceanic circulation. This circulation drives the global ocean circulation. It drives our distribution of temperature across the entire globe, and it's driven by the Gulf Stream, that, you know, the famous Gulf Stream that we see on our on our weather channel runs along the eastern margin of the United States, and then it branches off here. It shoots off to the east, usually right around Cape Cod. And this is what explains why, if you're swimming on the north shore of Cape Cod, you're looking at like 15 degrees colder ocean temps than the southern end of Cape Cod. And the Gulf Stream jets off here, and this is why Europe, or at least, you know, England and Ireland, they actually have some cactus species that grow on the west side of Ireland, because this Gulf Stream brings warm water, atmospheric warm air temperatures, as well as warm ocean temperatures to the western coast of Ireland and England. It sinks, that water is highly dense, highly saline. It sinks here in the North Atlantic and becomes bottom water, and then continues to travel around the rest of the globe. The Day After Tomorrow, and much of climate change theory, is that the slowing of this sinking, as the slowing of the Gulf Stream, is the slowing of the distribution of temperature from the tropics to the poles. And that is what's going to cause massive, they say, ice ages here in the north, and super warming around the central equatorial bands of the globe. What's happening, however, is we've observed, and say the warming event of 2012 in the Gulf of Maine, is that the Gulf Stream is becoming less consistent. It's becoming less reliable. And this warming event in 2012, you can see here in the buoy data, all those orange dots shows that almost every day of that year, we broke the record of water temperatures in 2012. So what we're saying is, if you remember in 2011, 12, there were two major hurricanes that came, and they brought the Gulf Stream up around Cape Cod into the Gulf of Maine. And it brought warm water that literally warmed our Gulf of Maine waters about those 8 degrees centigrade. The Gulf Stream has essentially, it's retreated a little. It moved 213 kilometers north and west in order to be able to do that. It has retreated some, but because of its inconsistency, we're seeing more warm core rings. So you can see here, there's these rings that spin off of the Gulf Stream and then travel into the Gulf of Maine. So prior to 2000, we saw fewer warm core rings than we've seen since 2000. And since 2010, we haven't necessarily seen the duration of those warm core rings is staying longer. And that's what's contributing to the Gulf of Maine being warmer overall. The other thing to be thinking about the Gulf of Maine is that we, again, was talking about those two sources of water. This is warm water coming in from the south, and then we have the Labrador Current, which brings cold water into over the Northeast Channel here. So we essentially have like one of those old taps where you have a hot water dial and you have a cold water dial. And the hot water, in any given year, we have conditions that are drawing from the hot water tap more than we're drawing from the cold water tap. The cold water tap is largely driven by a large atmospheric pressure system that sets up basically over Canada. And it will relax or move to the east or west or south, and it drives what happens with the Labrador Current and how much water we get from a cold water source. The Northeast Fisheries Science Center in Woods Hole produces a state of the ecosystem report every year. And in their report this past year, or for this year, they noticed that they report that slope water proportions in the Northeast Channel, with again, the red line being the hot water tap and the blue line being the cold water tap. We're seeing that proportionally more hot water is coming in than cold water in the past 5-10 years. So this is a really important thing, that it isn't so much that someone has like the burner on into the Gulf of Maine. It's that our source of the water, based on large scale atmospheric and oceanographic conditions, are driving where our water is coming from in the east, in the Gulf of Maine. So hopefully that provides some clarity about what's happening. But again, change will be dynamic, and Eastern Maine's experience is not like that in Western Maine. So this is another thing I wanted to bring, again, talking about scale. These are sea surface temperature anomalies from 2019, and these gray lines here are depicting different biogeographic areas in the Gulf of Maine. And so what we'll say is, like, left or enclosed in this box is the Western Gulf of Maine, and enclosed in the right-hand side here is, oh, it's Canadian, so they don't really concern themselves much with collecting data in this area. That's pretty sad, but that's essentially how it works. And when they've done these state of the ecosystem reports, they don't include data from this area east and north of this gray line. They are solely reporting on the area within this box. Then there's the Georges Bank area, and that's enclosed within this sort of kidney bean shape here. So what the way to read these graphs is that the cooler blue or purple is showing you an anomaly. So it's cooler than normal or long-term average temperatures. The red or the pink is warmer than long-term average. And so last winter, we saw this sort of central area affected by, or off of Penn Bay, was cooler than average with water temperatures. While here in Eastern Maine, pretty much no change. The spring was warmer in both of these areas with pretty much no change. Summer was very much more intensely warm. Georges Bank was strangely cooler. And we have some change, but kind of still no change here against the coast of Eastern Maine. And fall, we see much more of a ubiquitous sharing of experience, at least throughout the Gulf of Maine, with still there kind of being this weird no change in the fall at Georges Bank. So I just want to point out that we're not going to see, or everywhere's experience is going to be different. And that what this begs is that we may need to be collecting data at finer scales, and we may need to change our management strategies while we transition. That's more specific to the experience of a certain area. So one of the tools that we could use to do that are our oceanographic buoys. And here's buoy I, again, located kind of due south of Mount Desert Island. And it's the buoy that most fishermen here locally use in order to kind of check the weather and see whether they should go out in the morning. And these are the daily averages, or the daily means for 2018 and 2019. And to give you an idea, 2018, well, first, the buoy was offline through much of the spring, and then the buoy came online again, and we're seeing midwater temperatures or 50-meter depth temperatures that are warmer than average, but not at the peak. And then later in the year, they drop down to the average. Last year, if you remember, we heard that lobster landings were pretty slow. Well, here they are around the average. And this is about the date. I probably should have grabbed one for the whole year. Right around this time last year, we saw a spike, a warming event happen here around Columbus Day weekend. And for anyone who was talking to any fishermen in the area, that's exactly when the landings just jumped, and we were able to recover our slow landings from earlier in the year for those offshore fall and winter fishermen in the latter half of 2019. So, one of our challenges, I will say though, is that buoy I has been offline since February of this year. So we have not had this tool in this region basically since February. And that's concerning. It's because of COVID-19. They haven't been able to service it, et cetera, but it's concerning because it's really one of our only eyes and ears out into what's happening in the ocean temperature-wise for this region. So one of the things we're working on at the Maine Center for Coastal Fisheries is this Eastern Maine Coastal Current Collaborative, known as EM3C. And it's a collaboration between us at the Maine Center for Coastal Fisheries, the NOAA Fisheries Service, and the Maine Department of Marine Resources. And I use this image here. Those of us from the island recognize it and love it. It's our Deer Isle Sedgwick Bridge, and it connects us. It's our connector. And without it, we rely on this. It's also a sense of our identity. And so I think the main goal of the Eastern Maine Coastal Current Collaborative is to basically, how do we measure data in our area of Eastern Maine that looks to behave quite differently, or to be experiencing different conditions than that measured in the rest of the Gulf of Maine? How can we measure what's happening here and act accordingly and develop the networks to make those decisions? So EM3C objective is to develop a research framework that supports ecosystem-based fisheries management in Eastern Maine and its associated watersheds. So this dark area is the footprint of where we're talking. You can see that it pretty much overlaps with that area that is different from the rest of what the Fisheries Science Center calls the Gulf of Maine. And it essentially takes over Lobster Federal Fishing Area 1 with the Zone D, CD line here. And then it goes up into the Penobscot watershed, essentially, and to the Canadian border. And the reason for this is because we're experiencing great river restoration in this area. We're having a lot of prey fish be restored, and the connectivity between the rivers and the oceans is getting back to that we haven't seen for at least a century or almost two. So if we're to do what is ecosystem-based fishery management? Well, here we're talking about it linking marine and river ecosystems, but it could also be a tool to improve resource management and climate change adaptation. So one of the things that we would see if we were to implement ecosystem-based fishery management here is that we would be looking at the whole system as opposed to single species management, and that might help us be more reactive or more adaptive to the changes that we're seeing. And the way we propose doing that is by building human networks. and really relying on much of the connectivity that exists here in our fishing communities in Eastern Maine. These Washington and Hancock County in Eastern Maine are the two most fishing dependent counties on the Eastern Seaboard, and fishing matters. It's really important to our school systems, to our healthcare system, to the infrastructure of our communities. And because it matters so deeply, getting it right here, figuring out how to adapt and change, and to bring all hands on deck with observations and priorities and values is basically essentially what we're proposing to do with the Eastern Maine Coastal Current Collaborative. So with that, I'll thank you for your time and listening, and I'll open it to questions now. You can type into the Q&A box if you'd like. Or I lost everybody. Anything coming in? Okay, so what patterns of invasive species are you seeing? Well, thanks, Jim Fisher, for that question. Honestly, invasives I can't speak too much to. That's not something I've spent a lot of time on. I see also there's another gentleman asking about green crab. So green crab has had very inconsistent reactions. So the green crab is also an invasive species. It's been here, like 80 years. And we are seeing invasives coming, but there's this interesting trend that Northeast Fisheries Science Center State of the Ecosystem report shows, in that we're not necessarily seeing an increase of species to the north yet, which technically you could call some of those species invasive. We're not seeing those fishery species moving north yet, but we're seeing the biomass of those species shifting along the shelf and offshore, primarily offshore, similar to how our lobsters are responding to the warming water temperatures. So we are seeing lots of sea squirts. We're seeing lots of things like that weren't normally here. But largely what we're seeing for invasive species, from what I understand, are the ones that have been here not just because of climate change. Some of them may be doing better than they would have because they came from warmer climates, but their delivery hasn't come necessarily because of climate change. Their success might be affected by climate change, but their delivery here hasn't been due to climate change. Any other questions? Oh, I've got a chat question. Okay. With increased connectivity to rivers and streams, what saltwater fish or other species would be expected to return or increase? So what saltwater fish, so there's a couple hypotheses happening here, but essentially with increased connectivity to the rivers, you have anadromous fish coming back, our smelts, we have alewives coming back, river herring species. And what that is those are prey fish that are in the nearshore area and providing a food source to potentially codfish, potentially other groundfish species, or black sea bass, or other potentially fishery species that would need to have that prey base in order to successfully establish themselves here and become an opportunity of diverse fishing in the future. So I hope that answered your question, John. Rick, as a part of the EM3C effort, what type of observations, if any, are you trying to collect and how? So I'll say there's a full range of these types of observations. We are starting with community observations, community level identification of what we need to observe and how we define the linkages in the ecosystem here. So there's going to be socioeconomic data that we would be observing. We would also be collecting say like the oceanographic data. We have an open proposal now with Nearacus, with that ocean observing system, to try to put some nearshore buoy systems in, because we have very limited observational data about both our riverine and our nearshore environment in eastern Maine. We also are hoping to that would be one thing, just a lot of more oceanographic and kind of physical and chemical, I would say, data from those regions. And then there would be some species information. But right now, that's where we are with EM3C, is identifying exactly which of those observations are the priority based on how the community sees the linkages here. Any other questions? Q&A. Oh, scroll down more. Okay. Ron, can you talk about seaweed and sea level rise in conjunction to temperature change? So I'm not sure I fully understand your question, Ron. So talk about seaweed and sea level rise. So sea level rise here along the coast of Maine is less related to temperature change. So it's more related to storm surge and storm events, which is temperature change, but it's also more a function of those storms that are being driven not necessarily by how warm the water is in the Gulf of Maine. It's being driven by the other processes kind of often in the broader climate world. So, and seaweed, are you talking about invasive seaweeds, or I'm not really sure what your question is there. I'm sorry. I do know that there's aquaculture that is trying to take advantage of some of the warming temperatures and trying to offset some of the carbon cycling in nearshore areas, but I'm not exactly sure what you're asking. Sorry. See if you can type it in again somewhere lower down. What was the creature in the last photo you showed, Jackie? So, screen share. You can see the chaos that is my screen right now. Share back. Can you go back? This one? This is a North Atlantic right whale, and that's the American lobster. That is a herring. This is a black sea bass, and this is a copepod, Calanus finmarchicus. And the reason this is here is because this is also we'll say a victim of climate change in the Gulf of Maine. You get this clear area here is its fatty lipid layer, and it is food for the North Atlantic right whale. It is what the North Atlantic right whale comes into the Gulf of Maine to feed upon in the summer. And we have seen huge declines or a huge shift from these larger fatty copepods to smaller, just smaller zoo and phytoplankton in the Gulf of Maine. So we've had a great loss in nutritional value of our phytoplankton and zooplankton communities in the Gulf of Maine as a result of warming water. Stop share, go back to the Q&A. Are you seeing changes in the fishing community regarding their attitudes toward climate change, regarding both GOM and sea level rise, storm surge on land? Thanks, Randy. Yeah, I mean, I think fishermen are kind of the sentinels of the sea. They see a lot of changes already happening. I don't know that I'd necessarily say that since 2010, when I moved to the coast of Maine, that the fishing community is more accepting of the term climate change. I mean, the term climate change is so politicized, but are they seeing new species and wondering what they are, or new to them. I mean, black triggerfish or gray triggerfish and other critters, seahorses and things like that, they're seeing, but I don't know that it's different from what it was before. It's just they've always lived kind of, everything's different. And the pressures that they're experiencing aren't just around climate change. The pressures that the fishing fleet is experiencing are more market driven, which may be rooted in climate change, but there's market driven changes and there's, regulatory changes or pressures that are related to climate change, things like that. So I don't know that necessarily in the past 10 years, fishermen's perspectives have changed. They're just seeing the manifestation have very, very different faces. As far as sea level rise, storm surge on land, I know like the town of Stonington has been very aggressive working on how to restore and build shoreline access and shoreline infrastructure so that it can be responsive to sea level rise. They're actually one of the most progressive towns and gets reported as such in larger national venues. So I think we're kind of ahead of the curve here on the island, actually, and a lot of other places in Maine look to Stonington to lead how we're doing that. Impact, Ron, impact on commercially useful seaweed and invasive seaweed. Is that who asked that question before? Yeah, I'm still not really, the impact of rising temperatures on commercially useful seaweed. I can't say that I've been seeing too much or that I have delved into much about seaweeds with changing temp. Sorry. What about acidification of the sea? Is that happening in the Gulf of Maine, and how does it affect lobsters and other crustaceans? Well, this is a good question. So ocean acidification is primarily driven by atmospheric carbon being taken into our ocean surface areas. What is primarily happening in the Gulf of Maine is less that process of ocean acidification and more a coastal eutrophication, which means that we have a lot of nutrients running off from storm surge, from untreated wastewater, from other things, from treated lawns and things like that. We're seeing this eutrophication happening, and that affects our pH of less our kind of water environment and more of our intertidal environment. So yes, the intertidal species are experiencing some acidification. And how does it affect lobsters? Well, we haven't seen it affect lobsters in the wild yet necessarily, but laboratory studies it suggests that it could go either way for the different stages of lobster. Larval lobster may be more robust while the eggs are really vulnerable to it, or I might have that backwards. So we don't necessarily have that. It's more of our intertidal shellfish that we have seen, we'll say an edging kind of effect on clams. A lot of our intertidal, like clams, are seen to have pock marks or thin shells in the more acidified muds. Is that everybody? Any other questions? Okay, one more. Jim Fisher, your point about our land use policy, particularly stormwater management, will be very important for town governments to understand. Thank you for making that point. Yeah, you're welcome, Jim. That's a big one. And definitely part of ecosystem-based management moving forward. And in our community meetings thus far, it has come up as water quality has come up as a very important first point. Okay, thank you so much. Very interesting. Anyone? Okay, well, I guess I'll call it there. Go ahead, Nina. I'll bow out.
Well, hello again, everybody. That was amazing. It was really good. Dr. Guenther, thank you so much for that informative presentation. I don't think I'll ever look at the water surrounding our island the same way again. And I'm confident everyone watching is as grateful for your time as I am. And to all of you, thank you for joining us today. If you've enjoyed this presentation and you wish you could share it with others, you can. Dr. Guenther has graciously given us permission to post the recording on our website, and I'll have the video up in a few days. People can access it from both the homepage and the event page on our website at deerislelibrary.com. And if Facebook Live has worked as it should, hopefully it will also be on the Chase Emerson Memorial Library Facebook page. That's always unclear until after. Also, for those of you who want to understand more about what MCCF is doing, please check out their website. They just have a lot of information there. You can, if you're interested in getting their newsletter, you can send them an email and ask for that. I'm sure they'd be delighted to just inform more of you if you're not already people that are hearing from them. And also, I just want to say that Chase Emerson Memorial Library relies upon charitable contributions from friends like you for almost 2/3 of our annual budget. Your cash gift is tax deductible to the extent allowed by law and goes directly to support our many services and programs. In an era where much is needed reinventing, we continue to look for ways to serve this community safely and well. Please, if you are able, consider donating to help us continue. You can visit our website at deerislelibrary.com and click the donate button, or send a check to Chase Emerson Memorial Library, P.O. Box 9, Deer Isle, Maine, 04627. As always, I can be reached via email at deerislelibrary@gmail.com or by phone at 207-348-2899. Thank you again to all of you for participating in today's event, and have a great evening.